Prime Minister and the Health Secretary, the men in charge of Britain's fight against coronavirus, both test positive for the disease as the UK's death toll climbs again. Just hours after joining the nation to applaud NHS workers, Boris Johnson found out he too had the virus.
I've developed mild symptoms of the coronavirus, that's to say a temperature and a persistent cough, and on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer I've taken a test that has come out positive.
The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, with the Prime Minister 2 days ago, also has it, and the government's Chief Medical Advisor, Professor Chris Whitty, is displaying symptoms. The Principality Stadium in Cardiff is to be turned into a temporary hospital for 2,000 people, along with huge conference centres in London, Birmingham and Manchester. In Italy, almost 1,000 people have died since yesterday, the biggest one-day rise in a country locked down for more than 2 weeks. For the first time since 9/11, refrigerated lorries are lined up in New York as temporary morgues. President Trump signs a $2 trillion rescue plan for the US economy. And England's huge new army of volunteers gear up to help the most vulnerable. More than 700,000 people have now joined the scheme starting next month.
Later on BBC London, the Mayor warns the capital to prepare for a huge number of deaths as cases of coronavirus rise again. And the community volunteers taking freshly cooked meals direct to NHS staff.
Good evening. There's been a big rise in the number of people in the UK who have died of coronavirus. 181 lost their lives in the past 24 hours, and more than 6,000 are now being treated in hospital. It comes as the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary have both tested positive for the virus. The government's Chief Medical Advisor, Professor Chris Whitty, is also self-isolating after displaying symptoms. In a video on social media, Boris Johnson said he currently has mild symptoms and will be working from home to lead the national fight back against coronavirus. The UK death toll has now reached 759 in just 3 weeks. Here's our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young.
Keeping their distance. Like many neighbours, the Prime Minister and Chancellor stepped outside to pay tribute to NHS staff last night. But 4 hours later, Boris Johnson tested positive for coronavirus.
I've taken a test that has come out positive, so I am working from home, I'm self-isolating, and that's entirely the right thing to do. But be in no doubt that I can continue, thanks to the wizardry of modern technology, to communicate with all my top team to lead the national fight back against coronavirus.
That top team has been spending less time in the same room this week. Cabinet was held remotely. The chief medical and scientific advisors were keeping further apart at online press conferences, but today Chris Whitty said he had symptoms and was self-isolating.
The NHS said tonight that staff would start being tested for coronavirus from next week, including critical care nurses, intensive care staff, ambulance workers and GPs. There's concern about the number of NHS staff currently off work because they're self-isolating with possible symptoms. Meanwhile, more preparations are being made to care for the thousands of patients expected over the next weeks. The Principality Stadium in Cardiff will be turned into a temporary hospital, providing 2,000 extra beds, as will conference centres in London, Birmingham and Manchester. It has been the biggest daily rise in deaths since the beginning of the outbreak there. Almost 1,000 people have died in the past 24 hours, taking the total number of deaths in Italy to more than 9,000. Well, Mark Lowen is in Rome for us tonight, and this huge increase is in a country that's been locked down now for more than 2 weeks.
Yeah, really shocking figures, Sophie. It's like Italy is losing the equivalent of a village a day. 919 deaths in the past 24 hours. That's over 200 more than the previous one-day rise. In the northern region of Lombardy alone, 540 people have died there in the past day. You mentioned that lockdown that's been in place for over 2 weeks. It is flattening the curve. The infection rate is slowing here, but the progress is slow and it is uneven, and the awful news just keeps on coming. 46 doctors have now died here since the outbreak began. The National Health Institute says Italy has not yet reached the peak, and the nationwide restrictions might have to be extended for several months. Tonight, meanwhile, the Pope gave a special address on a very, very empty St. Peter's Square, he gave his Urbi et Orbi blessing to the city and the world, which he usually only gives at Christmas and Easter, so another sign of the historic times we're in. He talked of the thick darkness enveloping our cities. He said we find ourselves afraid and lost, and he said doctors, nurses and caregivers were exemplary companions on this journey. But in truth, Sophie, Italians are finding it hard at the moment to keep the faith. They are hoping, pleading, many of them are praying for that peak to come.
Mark Lowen in Rome, thank you. In Spain, the number of coronavirus cases continues to increase, with 769 deaths in 24 hours. With so many critically ill patients, it has meant that more and more are dying alone because their families aren't allowed in. It's putting an enormous emotional strain on families and on medical staff, as our correspondent Damian Grammaticus reports from Madrid.
From his bed, he waves, a moment of triumph in a Spanish hospital. He's their first patient well enough to leave intensive care, but the medical staff are the only people there to see it. That's because every new virus patient brought in is immediately isolated from the outside world. Not even families are allowed to enter hospitals here, and Spain registered another 8,500 cases today. It's the awful reality Esther Garcia is facing. She has COVID-19 and tried to isolate herself, but she thinks she may have infected both her parents, Maria Paz and Constantino.
In France, the lockdown has been extended for another 2 weeks until the middle of April, with a warning it could be extended further than that. Almost 2,000 people have died there now, including a 16-year-old girl whose death this week has shaken many people in France. President Trump has signed into law a $2 trillion emergency spending package to relieve the impact of the coronavirus on the US economy. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs as a result of the crisis. More than 100,000 people in the States now have the virus. That's more than any other country in the world. Almost half of them are in New York State. From there, here's Nick Bryant.
New York, New York, the worst infected city in what's now the worst infected country. There was always a sense that this planetary pandemic would end up ravaging this global hub. And while there's a deceptive calm on its now quiet streets, behind the doors of its inundated hospitals, the crisis is getting worse. Emergency calls have hit their highest level since the attacks of September the 11th. Hospital staff are describing a tsunami of patients flooding their emergency rooms. We're thought to be 3 weeks away from the peak here, and already they're exhausted.
It's been like a war zone, a medical war zone, working with limited resources, with the constant disparities and pain and suffering that we see, not only with those who are afflicted with the coronavirus, but also those who are coming in for trauma. And so it is very physically and mentally exhausting.
Hence, we're so together, which is what makes us special, gives us that New York energy, gives us that New York